4.5% to 5% growth target is the first time in 30 years we're seeing a figure below 5%. CNA's Yew Guan has all the details.
Li Qiang opened the National People's Congress, China's top legislature, detailing the government's work report in a speech lasting over an hour. Among the most closely watched items was China's economic growth target for this year, 4.5 to 5%. Premier Li acknowledged the country faces prevailing challenges both within and outside the country.
在肯定成绩的同时，我们也清醒看到面临的困难和挑战，外部环境变化影响加深，多边主义、自由贸易受到严重冲击。国内经济发展和转型中面临的老问题、新挑战仍然不少，新旧动能转换任务艰巨，一些企业经营困难，群众就业和增收难度加大，政府工作存在不足，一些政策实施效果仍待提高。
At least 1 in 3 local governments had failed to meet their growth targets in 2025, including the economic powerhouse of Guangdong. Local government debt has also been a concern. And according to the draft budget also released, debt to GDP ratio will stay at 4%, unchanged from last year, to support growth and to shore up local governments.
I don't think the current debt to GDP level is high compared to Japan, Europe, and US, while at the same time, the interest rate environment in China is actually going down and lower compared to the US. So that's why, in a dry powder perspective, the Chinese government got more bullets, if they needed to continue the stimulus to the economy. And from my perspective, I don't think they are putting everything in yet. That's why I'm saying that it's a very conservative budget or very conservative stimulus debt issue plan as of now.
This year's budget report vows to tighten the belt for the party as well as government bodies, but raises spending in areas such as defense, public security, as well as science and technology, with defense taking the lion's share. $265 billion is going to defense. That's nearly 5 times of Japan's, but a third of the US. Public security is also up nearly 6% to $36 billion. Over the coming week, delegates will review the targets and spending plan. While tweaks are possible, the broad direction is expected to pass. Yew Guan, CNA, Beijing.
We're joined by Dr. Zoe Liu. She's Senior Fellow for Council on Foreign Relations, and she speaks to us from New York. Well, thanks for joining us, Dr. Liu. We just heard from my colleague there, Yew Guan. So at 4.5 to 5%, is that a judicious range, given what the Premier himself has acknowledged, a severe and complex domestic situation?
Thank you, Wei-Su, for having me. In short, yes, the lower the GDP growth, less than 5%, but within the range of 4.5 to 5% remains in line with China's growth trajectory, and it is judicious. And it is a target. However, this target gives local flexibility and a lot of room to maneuver and perhaps to address the underlying longer-term economic growth challenges. So from that perspective, I'd say market as well as international observers and analysts should consider this as a very welcoming signal.
Why is it so important that local governments right now, given the burden they face, need that room to maneuver?
I'd say broadly speaking, Wei-Su, there are 3 major issues that local governments need to address. Number one, and perhaps most acutely, is rising, considering that the trade barriers, especially tariff and non-tariff measures in global markets remain high, and perhaps the uncertainties related to that is also high. So from that perspective, local government will have to make sure that they have the fiscal capacity to address domestic demand, considering that a shrinking or lowering export growth will have to be made up or compensated by growing domestic consumption. And then secondly, China has, from a long-term perspective, has a demographic challenge, meaning lower population growth, especially featuring less or lower birth rate, as well as pronounced aging population challenge. So from that perspective, local government, again, needs fiscal capacity to address the demographic challenge. And the last but not least is the local government debt issue, which has been a pronounced challenge. And the challenge here is not just the debt number itself, is also with regards to the murkiness or the lack of clarity of how much debt local government has shoveled under the table. So from that perspective, the room is very important.
All right, I'm going to force you now to try to bring those different issues together. So, and I'll raise two of them. So domestic consumption / demand, the need to raise that. And we're hearing more noise from that at this NPC. And we've heard that, in fact, not just for years, in fact, for decades. Are you seeing the right moves beyond just noise to suggest China is, in fact, really shifting from export-driven growth to growth driven by domestic demand and consumption?
Wei Su, you are absolutely right to notice and to emphasize the difference between noises and actual policy changes with regards to promoting domestic consumption. In fact, the Chinese government has been promoting the use of consumption to grow the economy since the early 2000s. But up until recent years, perhaps from 3 years ago, for the very first time, you see government documents promote domestic consumption ahead of improving the investment efficiencies. And this year, in terms of both in government report as well as the 15th five-year plan, there is consistent emphasis on domestic consumption. But here is the important part. Promoting domestic consumption is more of a tactical shift to address rising uncertainties, continued geopolitical risk in global market. It's not the strategic longer-term goal. If anything, the strategic longer-term goal remains to be achieving self-sufficiency.
So the difference between tactical as opposed to a strategic move, if the priority remains innovation so that China is independent, is able to pull ahead in the tech race, can you not have both? Can you not have boosting consumption as well as at the same time establishing tech dominance and autonomy?
With Su, you identified a critical dilemma right there, right? China is a country that can produce almost anything at cheaper price as long as the industrial policies prioritize it. But the challenge there is, even if China can produce everything, it became the largest producer of everything in international market. Sellers remain needing buyers. So from that perspective, I'd say achieving self-sufficiency in absolute terms is the wrong goal. But the goal, the strategic agenda to achieve self-sufficiency, especially with regard to technology innovation and things like that, is more with regard to the mentality, the leadership's mentality that U.S. and China is setting into this longer-term strategic rival. Therefore, China would have to mobilize its domestic market while at the same time achieving technological self-sufficiency. The goal is so that China is not going to suffer from international.
So the concerns internationally about excess capacity in China, is there a way for domestic consumption to become so large it can absorb that capacity, therefore meeting President Xi's both his goals of tech dominance and domestic consumption?
Right now, that is certainly the goal, and in particular, President Xi Jinping himself emphasized the dual circulation strategy, or which is a policy agenda that promote domestic consumption, and in particular prioritizes the use of domestic market and making international market, making export more of a supportive role. But that remains to be a longer term goal rather than have something easy to be achieved, because so far the economic growth engine remains to be a export oriented growth model. So how would the government achieve the longer term goal of using domestic market? It requires significant domestic reform, removing domestic barriers, especially from one province to the other. And more importantly, it requires a significant incentive shift so that provinces do not necessarily compete against each other in terms of implementing industrial policies that lead to overcapacity. As long as that incentive does not change.
I just want to squeeze in one final question before we run out of time. If you could diagnose China's economic ills right now, final question, what would you call this stage of China's economic development?
I'd say right now the Chinese economy is more of is a patient suffering from chronic structural ills. Is not a patient in ICU. Therefore, a lot of these discussions about peak China is wrong.
Thanks so much for joining us this evening, looking at this Government Work Report out of China at the NPC. Dr. Zoe Liu, she's Senior Fellow Counsel on Foreign Relations. She's speaking to us there from New York. Thank you.